We'll now look at an example using the United States rule. Our example says, Crystal plans to attend a national nursing conference. To pay for her airfare on November 1st, 2014, she takes out a 120-day loan for $400 at an interest rate of 12.5%. Crystal uses some birthday gift money to make a partial payment of $150 on January 5th, 2015. She makes a second partial payment of $100 on February 2nd, 2015. The first part of the question asks us to determine the due date of the loan. And we want to remember that the loan is for 120 days and it begins on November 1st. And so the first thing that we need to do is we need to determine how many days there are between November 1st and the end of the year. And so using our table on the right side of the screen, we're going to figure out what day of the year November 1st is. So going to the month of November, and the first day, we see intersecting that row and that column that November 1st is the 305th day of the year. And we know that a year has 365 days. So to determine how many days there are between November 1st and the end of the year, we can simply take the total number of days in a year, which is 365, and subtract off the 305. And this will tell us that there are 60 days between November 1st and December 31st. Now, we know that the loan is for 120 days, and we already know that 60 days are between November 1st and December 31st. So what about the other 60 days? And so those other 60 days are going to start with January 1st and are going to go until we hit the due date of the loan, which is what we're looking for. And so we can go back to our chart and we can look for day 60 in the chart. All right, and so that day is going to sit right here. Here's the 60 in our chart. And looking above and to the left of that number, we see that that corresponds to March 1st. And so we now know that March 1st is going to be the due date of the loan. All right, so to recap, 60 days between November 1st and December 31st, the additional 60 days between January 1st and March 1st. The due date of the loan will be March 1st. So let's move on to part B of this problem. Part B says to determine the interest and the amount credited to the principal on January 5th. So remember that on January 5th, she makes a partial payment of $150. So let's go to our table and let's determine what day of the year January 5th is. And so looking at the month of January and day 5, and we could probably actually do this without the table, we see that January 5th corresponds to the 5th day of the year. And so what we want to know is how far into the loan are we at January 5th? So what do we know? In Part A, we determined that the time from November 1st to December 31st was 60 days. And now we're saying that the time from January 1st until she makes this partial payment on January 5th is an additional 5 days. And so at the point that she makes the partial payment, she is 65 days into the loan. Now, in order to calculate the interest that has accrued at this point, we will use our simple interest formula. I is equal to P times R times T. And so we know that our principal, the amount that she borrowed, was $400. She borrowed the money at an interest rate of 12.5%. And remember that we need to put that in as a decimal. So 12.5% is going to be 0.125. And the time needs to be in terms of years. And so we'll take the number of days, which is 65 days, and we'll put it over a year. And recall that the banker's rule indicates that a year should be looked at as 360 days. So 65 over 360 gives us the portion of the year that we are at on January 5th. And so we're going to multiply these three together, and we're going to end up with $9.03. And that is our interest that has accumulated after 65 days of the loan. And so when Crystal makes her payment of $150, some of that payment is going to pay for this $9.03 of interest, and some of the payment is going to go towards her principal. And so let's figure out how much is applied towards the principal. So if I take $150, which is her payment, and I subtract off the amount of the payment that is going to pay the interest, because the interest has to be paid first, we see that she is going to have $140.97 credited towards her principal. And so at this point, how much does she still owe? The original loan, remember, was $400. And she's now paid $140.97 towards principal, leaving her a balance on the loan of $259.03. All right, so to sum this part up, the question is asking us to determine the interest. We have found the interest to be $9.03. And it's also asking us to find the amount credited to the principal. And we know that that's $140.97. And we're ready to move on to Part C. Part C asks us to do the same thing, but look at the partial payment that she made on February 2nd. So first thing that we need to do is we need to determine the number of days from the last partial payment, which was made on January 5th, until February 2nd. And so let's do that first. We know that January 5th is the 5th day of the month, or the 5th day of the year. And let's determine what February 2nd is. And so we use our table. We find February, we look at day 2, and we see that February 2nd is the 33rd day of the year. And so how many days are there between January 5th and February 2nd? We'll simply subtract 33 minus 5, and so we're looking at a period of 28 days. Now, let's calculate the interest that has accrued between January 5th and February 2nd. And so we'll use our formula. I is equal to P times R times T. Remember that the principal has now been adjusted based on her first partial payment. So the principal is now $259.03. The interest rate stays the same, and remember again, we're putting it in as a decimal. And the time needs to be in terms of a year, and so we've got 28 days over 360 days. And we're going to calculate this interest, plugging this into our calculator and doing the multiplication. We get $2.52. So again, when she makes her partial payment, and this time her partial payment is $100. When she makes her partial payment, some of that payment is going to pay this $2.52 of interest, and some of that payment is going to pay towards her principal. And so let's see what the breakdown looks like. We know that the payment is $100. We know that the first $2.52 goes towards the interest. Meaning that the remaining $97.48 applies towards her principal. And again, to sum it up, the question asks us to determine the interest, which we have done here, and also to determine the amount credited towards the principal on February 2nd, which is what we have done here. Now, before we move on, we do need to determine how much principal is left at this point after she has made these two partial payments. So remember, after the first partial payment, her principal was down to $259.03. And she has now made a payment of $97.48 towards her principal, which means that her new adjusted principal is $161.55. And we'll need that as we move into part D of the problem. The last question asks us to determine the amount that Crystal must pay on the due date. Remember, the due date of the loan is March 1st. So how much does she have to pay on March 1st? So we know that the principal at this point is $161.55. The first thing that we need to determine is how many days are there from her last partial payment, which was made on February 2nd, until the due date of the loan. So let's do that first. So February 2nd Remember, if we use our chart, February 2nd corresponds to the 33rd day of the year. And the due date of the loan, March 1st, corresponds to the 60th day of the year. So to determine how many days between March 1st and February 2nd, we simply subtract. So 60 minus 33 gives me 27 days. And so let's go to our interest formula. I is equal to P times R times T. Let's plug in what we know. We know the principal at 161.55. We know the interest rate at 0.125. And we now know the time, 27 days out of 360. We'll multiply these three numbers together, telling me that she owes an additional $1.51 of interest. So what we know at this point is that her principal is $161.55 and she owes $1.51 in interest. So what is the amount that she has to pay on March 1st? She has to pay the $161.55 in principal, and she has to pay the $1.51 in interest, bringing her total payoff to $163.06. And so determine the amount that she must pay on the due date. She must pay $163.06.